Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism, the show that finds anarchism, non domination, cooperation, mutual aid in your everyday life. I am your host, Graham Culbertson. I promised all the way back in March, when I published my episode on the dawn of everything, that there would be more episodes with experts, and here we are. Today I am joined by four anarchist archaeologists, members of the Black Trowel Collective, to discuss the book. We had so much to say that our panel went for over 90 minutes, so I decided to turn it into two episodes. So this is the first half of my conversation with four anarchist archaeologists about the new Graeber-Wingrove book, The Dawn of Everything. They will introduce themselves, and you'll hear our conversation after the music. Okay, hello, welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. This is a very special episode today, the very first panel discussion I have had. It's on the topic of The Dawn of Everything, the book about an anarchist, or at least egalitarian rereading of all of human history by David Graeber and David Wingrove. And I'm joined today by a subset of a collective of anarchist archaeologists, the Black Trowel Collective, to talk about this book. They will introduce themselves, and also, please, as we do this, tell the listeners about the Black Trowel Collective and if there's any way they can support you or get involved.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. My name is Louis Bork. I'm one of the collective members. The Black Trowel Collective has been around since, gosh, I think in 2016 is when it formed. It really started to coalesce in 2014 and 2015, but there's been archaeologists since the 90s, at least in Europe and in North America, who've been applying anarchist frameworks and actions. One of our kind of matriarchs is a woman who goes by the initials TK, who started a labor zine for field techs. So these are folks working on the ground doing archaeology for companies. Essentially, the majority of archaeologists actually work for for-profit companies and globally to try to improve labor conditions, because it's a hugely underfunded and kind of trampled class of individuals working essentially construction, but getting paid less than most of the other folks working construction. And in the 2000s, a number of us came together and started talking about how we could apply all of these ideas, which some of us had been interested in for a really long time. Others were coming newly to it. And instead of it being like a traditional kind of academic conference, it just ended up with a bunch of us sitting around and becoming friends, and realizing that we had similar ideas of where we wanted to see the world go, and archaeology as well. And so we published, we co-wrote together a manifesto and published that online, and you can actually find that on our website now. If you just Google Black Trowel Collective, our website pops up. And we've been pretty active since then, especially since the pandemic's hit, and we've been expanding fairly steadily as well. I forget what our counts are now, but we're fully international. Like, I think we're in every single time zone on the planet at this point. And we have started an incredibly successful mutual aid program called the Black Trowel Collective Microgrants project, and a sub committee of the collective works on that. And we all rotate through it, because it's a lot of emotional and cognitive labor to do this. But that's really oriented around funding working class Black and Indigenous archaeology students globally to help kind of ease severe economic issues that they're running into, particularly grad students and undergraduate students. So get people to actually have decent dinners, pay their rent. We've helped people with bail to get out of jail from protesting and that kind of stuff as well. So we're pretty our main goal is to make it as not onerous as possible for them to actually apply, so they can get the help they need.
Great, and if you give me a link, I will put that in the show notes, listeners, so you should be able to pull up your phone or wherever you're listening to this and click and read about this program and donate. Okay, who's next? We met Lewis.
I nominate one of the James to go.
I'll go next, I guess. I'm James Flexner. I work at the University of Sydney in Australia as an archaeology lecturer, and I do most of my research on the last 500 years and the kind of era of European colonialism in the Pacific Islands and the coastal areas of Pacific-facing Australia, and basically spend my time thinking about, if it took Europeans 500 years to make as big of a mess of the world as they have, what can we do in the next 500 years to kind of undo some of that mess? And so my kind of engagement with anarchism came both from a set of very deep frustrations with a lot of the kind of orthodox thinking within anthropology and archaeology, but also from a kind of sense of wanting to take the academic pursuits that I was interested in and actually use them to do something resembling good in the world.
Awesome. Thank you, James.
Go, James.
All right, we'll do double James. My name is James Birmingham. I'm also a member of the Black Trial Collective. I'm also on the board of the Institute for Anarchist Studies, and I am the archaeologist, in quotes, on this panel that I'm not in the academy. I'm a PhD dropout. And so I was pursuing a PhD at RPI in STS, doing kind of contemporary material culture studies, looking at collectors and collections and the production of the material objects for everyday life. And then I left the PhD program for a number of reasons. But so now, as far as my work in kind of material culture studies / archaeology, is my thing is really, what does archaeology bring to the table for anarchism? How can it make anarchism stronger? How can it make anarchist theorizing and thinking and ideas more robust and more powerful? Yeah, that's it.
And I'm Aris Politopoulos. I'm a lecturer for the archaeology of the Near East at Leiden University in the Netherlands, where I teach basically all sorts of stuff West Asia related, from early cities and states to empires to what have you. I generally specialize on late Bronze Age and early Iron Age Eastern Mediterranean. I have a very particular interest on empires and the archaeology of empires and how empires form and fall and how they are administered and all sorts of things about the populations of the empire, resistance to empire, and so on. My PhD was on Assyria, for example. So this is one component of my research, and the other component of my research is video games. I do a lot of stuff with archaeology in video games, archaeology in play, archaeology in board games, theorizing a lot about play and how we can use play to make archaeology better, how we can use play for communication, play to better our lives in general. So play is a big component of the things that I do also in the field. And it also somewhat ties in with my anarchist ideas as well, which initially had nothing to do with archaeology, but just the protesting and rioting the system, basically. And that culminated into just the last 15 years of me thinking about anarchism in various ways, and now also through the Black Trowel Collective.
Okay, that's everyone now, listeners, and that's Lewis, James, and Aris. So if you don't know who is speaking and it's not me, you can guess that it's James, and your odds are good. So now we're here to our topic today, which is this book, The Dawn of Everything. It merely explains everything and where it came from. I will say in my own episode on it, I find it refreshing that this is a book that tries to explain everything, like these other books, Guns, Germs, and Steel or Sapiens, yet comes from people who seem to actually know something about something, which I have not found to be the case for most of these books that claim to explain everything. And there's a real sense that the narrative of civilization, as I taught many times as I was teaching concepts like I was in the literature department, so world literature or Brit Lit 1 or whatever, the notion of civilization is this sort of thought experiment. Some people thought about it in Europe, especially in England and Scotland in the 16th and 17th centuries, and then France as well. And then that's sort of how history works. And when we have been studying history and archaeology, it's been to find the truth behind this thought experiment. And instead, the Dawn of Everything tries to actually read the material culture of the past to find how people lived and how the world became the way it is. But that's not something I can evaluate. I can evaluate the intellectual history, but I cannot evaluate the archaeological angle because I know nothing about archaeology. So I'll turn this question to all of you. You can all speak in turn. You can cut each other off if you want to. That's up to you. I'll stay out of it. But let's just start there. Like, to what extent, what is the value or what work is this doing in the field of archaeology? To what extent is this intervention fitting into the work being done in archaeology as you understand it? Go right ahead, Lewis.
All right, I'll jump on that one. I'm used to raising my hands. Can I go? It's interesting, and this kind of goes back to some issues that I think are really problematic that academics have just in general with books that aren't written for other academics, and it also, and it has other issues, wrapped up with where our research funding's coming from, who we're writing for, who's able to access our publications and our research and all that kind of stuff. In the grand scheme of things, like, I'll say this directly, that I have a lot of concerns with the book, but I also have a lot of things about the book that I love. I'm teaching a world archaeology class next semester, and I'm actually using that in my class instead of a textbook. And Aris and I have taught archaeology classes together when I was in London. Possibly the first time two anarchists taught an archaeology class together, but I'm not totally positive. And we had at least one student note that as a concern in their student evaluations. But it was a good class, and this was back in, when was this, Aris? Like 2017, 2018?
Yeah, 2017, I would say. Yeah.
And it was interesting reading the book, because I'd been working on something tangentially similar to this and talking to Graeber about it when he was still alive, and Wengrow here and there as well. And when Aris and I sat down to organize that class, the first thing I said was, like, I hate how we teach world archaeologies, because it's always about, like, here are these state level societies, here are these capital C civilizations. But I'm a North American archaeologist. Like, I've worked in South America, Central America, but I don't generally work with state level, what people would consider, quote unquote, state level societies. And one of the big, I think, takeaways that Wengrow and Graeber have in this book is that North America is weird when you look at things on a global scale. And I don't think it's as unique as they make it. And James Flexner can talk about that for sure. But it's definitely a counter to a lot of these narratives that they're using it for. And that's how I position myself within that class as well, was to be like, all right, so that's where people are doing all of this stuff, where they're aggregating power and doing this and that, and creating, like, large cities and urban organizations and such. And here's where they actively did not do that, and they tore it apart, and they found different directions to go. all of which is not me trying to brag, but it's to say that, you know, a lot of what the David squared, we've got 2 Jameses and 2 Davids in this conversation. We're talking about, it's not new in archaeology. But it hasn't been communicated by us to the public very well. I wrote something back in 2017 with a colleague, Shane Miller, about how indigenous ideals kind of underlay the American dream, and that was picked up in a few areas. But, you know, outside of like that minor thing that I did, and like a few things that Wengrow and Graeber wrote, and a couple other public things, most of what you see is this stuff from, like, you know, biologists like Diamond, or folks who are really kind of pulling on this, you know, we need, you know, bureaucratic organization and states to keep us from killing each other all the time. And so there's a lot of kind of blindness in terms of what data they're selecting, which I know is like an argument people have levered against Graeber and Wengrow for this, that they're cherry picking data and that kind of stuff. So I think, you know, it's doing what everyone should have done a long time ago, which is to communicate these really interesting findings to people who aren't academics, or who don't regularly read, like, you know, our white papers and stuff like that. That's really the most important and unique thing in terms of, like, at least how archaeologists are talking about this.
Yeah, and I think, you know, in another of his books on debt, Graeber makes this point that sort of for a long time, archaeologists and anthropologists in the academy kind of stayed away from so-called grand narratives, or we kind of just stuck with the ones that we had about the origins of agriculture and the rise of civilizations and all this stuff. And you know, Graeber, I think, kind of recognizes that, like, if we stay away from those things, they get picked up by people like Jared Diamond. And I don't want to waste all of our time here bashing Jared Diamond, because that's been kind of done to death. But, you know, Diamond he's a bird scientist. Like, he's not someone who actually studies people. He happened to work in New Guinea early in his career and met, you know, the kind of indigenous peoples of the highlands in Papua New Guinea. But he's not actually trained to understand their lives ethnographically. He clearly has a lot of blind spots about the recent history of what's happened in those places and how it's transformed those societies. And so he's made up a bunch of kind of very convenient just so stories that don't actually make a lot of sense to anyone who's really studied or lived with the people who live in those kinds of regions. And I think that's where books like The Dawn of Everything provide a really important kind of counter narrative and counterpoint. And I mean, what's interesting for me, given kind of where I've ended up in my life and in my career, was reading through some of the things that Graeber and Wengrow are writing about Native North America, and thinking about how well a lot of those sort of narratives actually parallel a lot of what we're starting to learn about Indigenous Australia in terms of, you know, people's mobility and their ability to move between different spaces, the ways that particular kinds of systems, like having a common system of kind of animal totems that allowed people to go in and out of different communities as a way of maintaining particular forms of autonomy. A lot of that stuff does kind of, it makes a lot of sense when you start looking at it and you start realizing that, you know, the kind of the state formations that we're familiar with in the present are really the historical aberration when mapped onto the grand sweep of human history. So even if there are particular nits that I would pick, and I'm happy to talk about those, you know, while we're having this conversation, there's definitely a kind of general sort of truthiness to the grand narrative that they're trying to put in place over the course of the book. And then, you know, I think the sort of open secret to all of kind of knowledge production is that any grand narrative is kind of there to be undermined by particular specific examples where things went in a slightly different direction. And that's why those of us who work in academic spaces spend so much of our time kind of firing these white papers that like 3 other people care about back and forth to sort of work on those specific bits of the reality of human existence across time and space, in ways that occasionally get picked up and are used to help to improve the grand narrative, right? So the ways that, for example, Graeber and Wingrove picked up on the work of our colleagues like Bill Angelbeck to actually kind of help to tell a better broad brushstroke kind of story that reaches a lot more people in the way that they have.
Go on, James.
I was just gonna to echo some of what James and Lewis just said. I agree that whenever you're going to do a big history, like capital B, capital H, it's not going to be perfect. And I would say that, you know, the Davids did cherry pick, but that's the work of building an argument that isn't going to be, I mean, the book's already too long. It could be a lot longer if it was going to, you know, try to pick up every citation that it possibly could. And I do think also for, I hate the term, but lay people, for lack of a better term, people who aren't in the field of archaeology or anthropology, when they think of archaeology, they think of it as a science the same way they do chemistry or biology. There's this like, oh, that's what the archaeology says. It's fact. But archaeology is more like philosophy or history in that it's a field where there are very strong disagreements. There's constant knowledge production. There are people who look at two stratification sites and look at the assemblage at both of them and come to wildly different conclusions about them and have equally sound reasoning behind why they're coming to those conclusions. So it's not like a black and white sort of, you know, it's not math. And like, you know, and math philosophers are going to be like, well, actually, math isn't like that either. But you know what I'm trying to say here is that when most people read a piece of archaeology or see something in National Geographic or on the History Channel or whatever, they're like, that's just fact to them. And the truth is, like, a field, just like all the sciences coming from like my science studies background, is, you know, it's under contention all the time. And I think what the book really brings to the table, and what I found it super useful for, is I think the vast majority of people, even people on the left, have the very teleological cookie cutter view of, you know, well, until agriculture, we couldn't have high enough population density in order to do X, Y, and Z. Like, that's like just the common sense ideas that people have. And the book's very good at being like, well, actually, look at all these examples of how that's not the case. Aris, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to echo all of the things that are being said. I very much agree. There is considerable value to this book. We can be pedantic all we want with our own little neck of the woods, in a way, and people have even for both Davids, right? Because both of them have worked on grand narrative ideas, and people have complained about it. And that, as an example, actually is a good one for Near Eastern archaeologists, because they tend to complain a lot about things that are being written there. But at the end of the day, it's just a great book. It brings a great argument, in my opinion. And I think that's the case with The Dawn of Everything. I'm not going to repeat the praise, because I think we can quadruple down to it, but I agree on all of it. It does bring in a narrative that is lacking in the world, a narrative that's lacking in the popular culture. And it's something that quite literally somebody had to do it. It was a dirty job, but somebody had to do it, and they did it, right? And we can only thank them for sitting down and putting the 10 years of work that this took them. I would even go as far as to say that I wish this book had been more cherry picking than it is, because it's, in the end, it ends up being this 600 pages volume. And in a couple of days ago, David Wengrow was in Leiden, and there was a question about this, actually. And And he said that their original idea was that this, I quote this was going to be like the Hobbit to their upcoming trilogy. They were planning to write 3 other books, and this was supposed to be the Hobbit. And now the Hobbit is supposed to be this very small book. But in a way, I wish it was a shorter book, because I don't mind the cherry picking, as everyone else has already said. At some point, you're cherry picking, and there will be points that you can't convince everyone because people will complain about your cherry picking. But if it had it been a little bit more concise, it might have reached even more people. Something that's already a New York's bestseller. I think it's not let's say an airport book, not in a negative way, but quite literally something that you can just read. But that's, again, I understand why. Exactly. I understand why they did it, but it is a lot, and it's good, it's excellent. But I'm also contemplating using this similarly to what Luis is saying. I've been talking to some colleagues in Leiden to have a seminar on this book, right? We take it chapter by chapter with students, and we do a critical evaluation of each chapter. So I think it can both be used for its popular outreach, which is extremely important. It can also be used as a handbook style that you can actually teach with young archaeologists, because it does have this different narrative that you can't really find in other textbooks. You can find it maybe in our papers or in the Anarchist papers that form a very small part of the archaeology literature out there, right? But you really have to look for them. And now you have a book that you can use, that people actually know. So for all of these, I think the Dawn of Everything is great. And I think we can criticize it rightfully for many other things, but it's important to underline also its value.
And I think, there's kind of 2 things here. One is, we should all be so lucky to have one of our books end up on the New York Times bestseller list, right? Like, I'm happy if I publish a book and it gets downloaded 500 times or whatever, let alone several million. But I think it's also important to kind of think about the fact that this book is not, it doesn't represent an endpoint, kind of regardless of whether Wengrow picks up and I think we have to acknowledge that, unfortunately, our colleague David Graeber passed away last year, which kind of is creates a certain kind of trajectory that we have to just kind of recognize as limited. But also, it's not just for them, right? It's not just for the 2 of them to write their Hobbit and then their follow-up trilogy. It's actually for everyone to kind of pick up and run with in whatever directions it needs to be run with. And there's a kind of similar effect in Australia, where there's a book by someone called Bruce Pascoe called Dark Emu, who's an Indigenous scholar who's written about kind of Aboriginal agriculture and urbanism and a lot of stuff that kind of upsets the received wisdom about, Indigenous Australia. And yes, you can fire all the same criticisms at that book about, cherry picking data and kind of glossing over things and specifics about particular sites or particular interpretations. But the point is, that book it's not there to be the book of, like, it's the classic thing of if the book actually contained the entire world in it, it would have to be the size of the entire world. And you can't sort of encapsulate that amount of complexity within 500 pages or whatever, but it provides us with a whole bunch of tools that we can then pick up with in our own research areas, in the ways that we communicate the knowledge we produce to the public, in the ways that we talk to each other about things, in the ways that we teach our students, that I think takes us in a whole bunch of productive directions that simply weren't there before. And that's where the value lies. It's actually, it's a foundation rather than a kind of endpoint.
Yeah, I'm going to introduce this concept. So I don't know what to call him, French intellectual Michel Foucault talks about these founders of the discourse, which is, you've got someone And you guys have already alluded to this to a certain extent. I mean, Freud is a famous example who comes up with these narratives that, civilization and its discontents explains how civilization works, not its history, but how it works in 120 pages. So of course it's entirely wrong. And yet there are still people, writing downstream of that book, exploring the ways that it is right and wrong and contesting each other. And Freud's work in general, and really that book specifically, founded this discourse. Many of the academic disciplines have a few founders, often in the late 19th century, who sort of, people keep going back to someone like Durkheim in sociology. I have thought before I read The Dawn of Everything that Graeber seems to me like a founder of a discourse, that all of his work is productive and provocative. And as you say, probably James said it because there's two of you, debt has already done that. Is that people, is debt right? No, of course not, because it's the history of all of money. And yet it's driven so many people already to think about money and write new books downstream of that. So I was hoping this book could be that, a foundation of a new discourse in archaeology. And I think I'm hearing that sounds right. In one sense, it's work that is relatively familiar to you already. But in another sense, it's going to drive all sorts of people to continue working on these topics in a new way or from a new angle. Or have I missed that?
No, I think I would say that that's a fair assessment of both Graeber's impact in our field, even in archaeology, not just more broadly in anthropology, but the book itself. I think, that is also why there's some frustrations both with Graeber and his research more generally, and this book in particular, because it is sort of this it's this giant boulder dropped in this stream, and you're getting all these ripples coming out of it. And I think you'd mentioned at one point as well, Graham, that they talk about how this is all brand new content that they're bringing, and so there's some frustration, I think, because those later ripples are treating that as a beginning point. And there was you can't cite everyone, you can't cite everything that's ever happened. It's going to become, even if they're citing 10% of what people have argued, it's going to become like an onerous, a burden for even to carry it between rooms to read it. But one thing that I was a little disappointed with in this was that their practices were not more inclusive in who they're bringing in to this conversation. And so a lot of the folks who'd been writing about this for a long time were generally excluded from the beginning of that conversation, at least as far as the book takes it, even if they've been in that conversation for 15, 20 years. And they talk about some folks like Carol Crumley, they talk about in their book, and she's definitely foundational for this. And in fact, I would even put her at the beginning of this kind of conversation, along with a couple other folks that kind of opened the doors for this conversation to actually happen in the way that Wengrow and Graeber did. I've always been really more specifically frustrated with Graeber, and I think this has to do with his concern about being viewed specifically as an academic anthropologist and not just as an activist anarchist in the academy. Is that there's a ton of contemporary and more recent work, even outside of the academy, within the anarchist realm, that he should have been drawing on. I felt like more frequently. He's really good at citing like classical theorists like Kropotkin and Bakunin and stuff, but even this book, it's treading ground that like Gelderloos, I think, who wrote Anarchy Works, has treaded, and like Sam Mabah for African anarchism has walked as well. And I didn't see those in there as I was reading them, so it felt frustrating that this is a big moment, right, in terms of like opening up this conversation. And there should have been a few more voices included.
I think there are a couple of interesting points in this. One is that at least up until a certain point, anarchism also suffered from this big men idea. So it's very easy to go back to the classics, and it's very easy to go back to Kropotkin and Bakunin and sort of also get stuck into the arguments between these. Me coming from a Greek anarchist background, which was on the theoretical level, it was still very much, at least in the 2000s, within that realm of discussion, right? So read your Kropotkins, read your Bakunin, and let's talk about this. And in many ways, it is good to go beyond that, and it is best to not recreate these circumstances today into new figureheads. I don't think necessarily David Graeber would ever want to be viewed as a figurehead as such. It sort of coincidentally happened, and in certain occasions, he also has said, like, I don't want to be labeled as an anarchist because I am an academic, and it's tough to be an anarchist as an academic. I take a little bit of issue with such statements because, yeah, you can still be an academic and an anarchist. But I do agree with Lewis that in that regard it could have been more inclusive, because whether you like it or not, you do hold the power to publish such a volume, and not to be too Spider-Man about it, but it does come with a certain responsibility, whether we like it or not. But David Bengrow made an interesting statement in that lecture, because one of our students, I think it was one of our students, who asked whether this book was a political statement, and Bengrow said that, at least from his point of view, it was not, at least not in the same way that, let's say, Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology was. That book by Graeber was much more of taking a political position in relation to the field, rather than what they're doing in the dawn of everything, which is something that I can see. And I do think what you're saying, Graham, about David Graeber and his narrative, I would see David Graeber more as sort of the last of the more traditional anthropologists, rather than the beginning of a new a new viewpoint in anthropology. So he managed to break traditional parts of the discipline, while still being like in the end of, say, 20th century anthropology, because you're still trained in it, but he could see its pitfalls and he could write about its pitfalls. So I see this more as hopes for a new beginning, rather than a new beginning in and of itself. And I think it is kind of echoed in the book in some ways, but there isn't that explicit, like they don't even bring up really anarchism in the book as such, right?
Yeah.
Which I had I'll finish very quickly, sorry, James, but I had this conversation with a colleague who I was asking him about the book. I'm not gonna name names, but I asked him, like, what do you think? Because you've probably read it. And he said, yeah, I don't really like it. I don't really like Graeber, but I think this is like, you probably like it because it's full of anarchism. I'm like, I don't think you've really read it then, because that's not the point of the book, I don't think. And with whatever pitfalls come with it, or whatever positives comes with it.
Yeah, and Graham, hopefully your listeners will indulge a little bit of kind of boring insider intellectual history, but one of the things that for me rings very clearly through the book, and I'd agree, you know, as anarchists, we want to kind of avoid so-called, quote, great man history. But as anthropologists, we're often interested in things like lineage and kinship. And one of the things that's really clear in this book is the influence of David Graeber's PhD supervisor, who's Marshall Solins, who's an anthropologist from the University of Chicago, who is another kind of master of the grand narrative. So you see the echoes of things like Solins's book, Stone Age Economics, in which one of the early chapters is called The Original Affluent Society, where Solons talks about the idea that, so-called hunter-gatherer people actually live pretty good lives if you look at their lives relative to people who live in agrarian societies. They don't have to work very hard. They usually have plenty of food and plenty of things. They spend most of their time kind of napping and telling stories and hanging out with each other. We should all be so lucky, is kind of the punchline from that particular work, at least as it's usually read and taught. It's a bit more complicated than that if you actually, read the chapter, but that's usually the kind of 30-second version of it that a lot of us kind of project to our undergraduates. And I think that's the other thing is, again, sort of thinking about the idea of how new is a lot of this argument. It's not that a lot of the underlying premises are completely new. It's that now the weight of evidence we have from the archaeological record has shifted so much during the last kind of 10 or 15 years through a whole bunch of new kind of findings, really kind of right around the world, from kind of Poverty Point to Göbekli Tepe to a whole bunch of stuff in island Southeast Asia, Australia, and the Pacific Islands that they don't even, get to in this book, because as we've been discussing, you can't talk about everything, you can't talk about everywhere. But the whole time I'm reading about all of the things that Graeber and Wingrove are writing about, I'm going, okay, but also, all of this stuff down here. So for example, the fact that we now know that at the same time that people are making the very famous cave paintings at places like Lascaux and Altamira in Europe, we now know there's equally old rock art from the north of Australia and island Southeast Asia. So we can't think about kind of these grand narratives of archaeology and kind of the origins of complex behavior as being this kind of European phenomenon anymore, right? We know that it's happening actually more or less across all of human society during that kind of late Pleistocene period and into the early Holocene. And I think it's that kind of bit of the trail of breadcrumbs that they've left us going through the woods that we need to start picking up on and kind of getting that knowledge out to a whole set of wider audiences, both in other kind of disciplines inside of academia, where I think that civilization narrative remains pretty ingrained, looking at you, humanistic geography, but also, into a public audience and into school curricula and into places where these should be the kinds of fundamental narratives that people just carry around with them in their heads.
So I do want to jump in here and go back to something that Aris said in terms of his colleague. I mean, I will go on record and agree with your colleague Aris that this book is full of anarchism. But my project was primarily inspired by Graeber and Kropotkin, and especially Kropotkin's book Mutual Aid, that argues that what is called anarchism, not as a political program, but as a practice, is something that can be found everywhere all the time, even under the most repressive circumstances. And the traditional job of the archaeologist is to find evidence that hierarchy and bureaucracy are either A, the only thing you can find, or B, what everything is moving towards. And in that sense, of course, this book is filled with anarchism, as is, in this broad definition. And boy, have I gotten some professional anarchists really mad at me for using this broad definition of anarchism in this sense that, carpools are anarchism. Anarchism is running all through the ancient world, but we haven't been looking for it. And also, carpools don't tend to build huge monuments in a way that bureaucratic states do. And so here's something for you guys to weigh in on with your expertise. I think the most provocative part of this book, okay, so you can have anarchism in hunter-gatherer societies, that's fine because they don't have big projects to do. But the idea that you could have anarchism in these larger dwellings, that they could be an imagined community in this Benedict Anderson sense, that people could imagine themselves as part of a civilization and could build an amazing thing as that civilization without the bureaucratic state that this grand narrative tells us is the only way to build something big. That is intensely provocative. And that's the part that I have seen get the most pushback. If you've got a city, you better have a state. And it is simply impossible. This is the argument, to have a city that runs in this kind of way. And that seems to be the thing that bugs people about this book. And that's ours. There's the anarchism that your colleague found, right?
Yeah, I can totally see that, especially from someone from an outsider perspective, as in outside of anarchism. Graeber has also written about these concepts, right? The are you an anarchist? The answer may surprise you kind of ideas, which I also subscribe to. That's why I also always thought it was a bit weird whenever David Graeber tried to distance himself from being described as an anarchist. But maybe I ask too much from the book. Maybe not. I'm not sure. I will leave whoever is judging this to judge it. But in a way, what from my perspective, where I see the anarchism lacking, and again, it might have been intentional, is that they put on they do the work. They do all the work in the book, and they do an excellent job in doing the work. But at the end, the conclusion feels underwhelming in the sense that I would have hoped for a powerful, provocative statement for the future rather than the debunking of the past. Because the debunking of the past is, for me at least, is only important if it is for a better future. And they conclude, there is this paragraph where they talk about the potentially unknowable future where maybe we get to see societies where women have the power to be the foundational changes rather than pyramids and statues, for example, right? But they describe this as a potentially unknowable future. And of course, the future is unknowable, but from an anarchist perspective, I don't see this as unknowable. I see this as a block in changing the system in a way that eventually will be more equal and more fair. So instead of ending on, well, when we look at the past and people talk about strict hierarchies and the development of the state and citizen hierarchies, we're in the presence of myths. I would say we're in the presence of myths that have defined our present, but we need to break these myths, and we broke these myths because they did it to change the future. So that is my, for the broader idea, that's my main criticism in a way, that it doesn't look for the future, which again, it might be asking much, or maybe it wasn't the intention at all. It might boil down to David's answer that this was not a political statement, and maybe we were also hoping for something else.
Okay, we are going to stop it there. You will hear us all respond to Aris's question, his challenge. What do we do now that we know that the standard narrative of human history is a myth? How can we use that to make a new reality? Remember that you can find me at everydayanarchism.com, which is also where you can make financial contributions to keep the show going. You also support the show every time you tell a friend about it, or you can leave a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. The music, which you're about to hear, is by David Hill.